Thank you. Thank you for sharing a bit of your good time with me this evening. It really is an honor to be here. Oh, there we go. And thanks to the Gallatin Wildlife Association.
Turn it on.
No, I think it's always on. They told me it's always on. It's always on?
It's on.
Fair enough. Now it's on. Now it's on. Now I don't have to yell. I would like to start this evening by drawing attention to a little-known fact that surfaced for a time 43 years ago, nearly to the day, in the winter of 1980. That fact: Mike Phillips is an asshole. Or so was proclaimed in big, bold, black letters on the wall of the men's room in a bar in Ely, Minnesota, in the winter of 1980. I can still see it. Two things made that statement cut like a razor. It was situated there among all the other pearls of wisdom. Things like gas, grass, or ass nobody rides for free. And there it was, for all to see. Mike Phillips is an asshole. Two things made that statement cut like a razor. First, I knew that it was written by a teammate of mine on Dave Meach's Wolf study crew. I recognized the handwriting from our capture data sheets. I knew exactly who it was. And secondly, it was true. It was absolutely true. At that point in my young career, I was so excited by the opportunity to work with wild things in a wild place that my exuberance made me insufferable. It was exhausting. I'm sure it was exhausting to be around me. I left the bar that night committed to doing two things. First, I was committed to tempering my outward displays of enthusiasm so as to not grind my teammates down any further. And I was committed to advancing the power of collective endeavors, the power of people working together. Ever since then, I've been blessed, over 40 years blessed, with great teammates, some of whom are in the room tonight. I would not be here if not for them, including my beautiful wife, who is without doubt my best friend. I have been blessed over the course of my career. Oh, we need to change the slide. I can get rid of this now. Y'all can still hear me, right? Yeah. Let me see if I can run this machine. Wow, that's loud. So let's see here. This is where we were supposed to start. That is, by the way, an Oplomono falcon. It's not an especially large bird. They mostly live on insects. I've been blessed over the course of my career to work on a host of imperiled species projects and conservation efforts, all of which were undergirded by the Endangered Species Act. My work began in the 1980s studying grizzly bears in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. After that, I was honored to be the first field projects leader for the red wolf restoration effort in the southeastern United States. That represented the first attempt in history to restore a carnivore species that had been declared extinct in the wild. Following that, I was honored. Oh, that's me in the hat in the middle picture, holding a little red wolf known as 344. She was the first red wolf born in the wild in a long, long time. Following that, I was honored to stand alongside Doug at the outset of the Yellowstone Wolf Restoration Project. That work gave rise to Ted Turner and I coming together and founding the Turner Endangered Species Fund and Turner Biodiversity Divisions. They stand as an effort to conserve biodiversity by ensuring the persistence of imperiled species through reintroduction projects that focus on private land. It has stood since inception as the most significant private effort in the world to use reintroductions to restore populations of imperiled species. Every species that you see on the screen, the upper left, the gopher tortoise, the black-footed ferret, the prairie dog, gray wolves, cutthroat trout, desert bighorn sheep, the red cockaded woodpecker, and many others have benefited from our work. We have posted some historical successes, and I'm quite proud that Ted has been a wonderful friend and a boss for so long. All of this work undergirded by the ESA. Following that, I'm also proud to say that I served in your Montana legislature for 14 years. 6 years in the Montana House, which is where this picture was taken, and 8 years in the Montana Senate. The Endangered Species Act has been regarded as a great environmental law. It passed Congress with nearly unanimous consent and was signed into law. The bill passed with nearly unanimous consent and was signed into law by President Nixon on December 28, 1973. Since passage, it has been heralded as a great environmental law. It's also been attacked as governmental overreach that pits the welfare of people against the prospects of trivial non-human life or consequential non-human life that gets in our way. Regardless of where you stand on the spectrum of celebration or condemnation, the Endangered Species Act is absolutely consequential. My time in the state legislature gave me invaluable experience in the world of electoral politics, the running and winning of elections. That experience would prove invaluable for conceiving and designing the use of direct democracy to establish a state-based mandate to restore an imperiled species. The Endangered Species Act is a complicated bit of business. Tonight we do not have time for a deep dive. Tonight we have to focus on just the Act's basic aspects. Two that I'll make reference to repeatedly are current range, where you would find a species today, and historical range, where you could have found that species in the distant past. Those two aspects, current range and historical range, are central to addressing an important question posed by the law. Restore to what? On this note, Congress is notably silent. But please know, by focusing on current range and historical range, by no means do we do anything but scratch the surface of the Endangered Species Act. For example, take this particular bolson tortoise. The little guy in the upper left corner, he was about this big. When we found him, he was known as 09DW1. His name means a lot. 09 stands for 2009. That's the year we found him. DW stands for deep well. That's where we found him. And 01 stands well for number 1. 09DW1 was the first bolson tortoise born in the continental United States in over 15,000 years. That is 09, the lower right picture. That is 09DW1 in 2020, when he was 11 years old. 09 begs the question, should the Endangered Species Act be mindful of the Pleistocene? Should we use prehistoric range as well as current range and historical range for wondering about advancing recovery under the law? As fascinating as the Pleistocene is as a restoration compass, we don't have time to dive down that deep rabbit hole. Tonight we're going to focus just on more basic, simpler aspects of the law. But be mindful, as climate change reshuffles the ecological deck, it is rendering concepts like historical range increasingly irrelevant. We have taken a deep dive into this basic question: do you use deep time to guide restoration effort? We've published our work. Joe Truitt was a wonderful teammate of mine for so very long. We have scratched this itch hard, and we have said we believe that sometimes deep time is an appropriate compass. That paper probably represents the most significant, certainly the most unique intellectual contribution the Turner Endangered Species Fund has made. But tonight, we can't go any further than making reference to that important paper. My first real brush up against the Endangered Species Act came in 1980, when I was hired to work on Dave Meach's seminal study of wolves and their prey in northeastern Minnesota. That's what resulted in the bathroom graffiti. In a nation of laws, it's altogether fitting that it was the Endangered Species Act that brought about the action needed to pull gray wolves back from the precipice of extinction and ecological uselessness. Be mindful, the central aim of the ESA is recovery. And at that point in time, the gray wolf was not in good shape. Recovery is the aim of the law. In the legalese of the law aims to ensure that all methods and procedures which are necessary to bring any threatened or endangered species to the point at which a measure is provided pursuant to this act are no longer necessary. In other words, the federal government is required by law to provide sufficient security for these species so that the future is more certain. And be mindful, this is not a discretionary activity. This is mandated by the law. It says without equivocation, the Secretary, mostly the Secretary of the Interior, shall develop and implement recovery plans. It is with these 8 words that the rubber meets the road. For the recovery mandate to be operationalized, you have to define what is a threatened species, what is an endangered species, and then you need to develop a list of those species so you know what the targets are. Not surprisingly, the law accounts for these needs. It defines an endangered species. Any species in danger of extinction throughout all or significant portion of its range. And threatened, you can read it, the only difference, threatened, they're about to become endangered. Any species can be considered as potentially threatened or endangered against 5 factors that might threaten, compromise its future. 5 listing factors: habitat destruction, overutilization, etc. That's the essence of the law. Tonight, I'm going to work against a very simple premise. If we know what an endangered species is, if we know what a threatened species is, then we should be able to work backwards and define what it isn't. So again, just simple semantics. If you look at the definitions, we just saw endangered and threatened, so focus now on just a recovered species. Any species that is nowhere endangered or threatened, secure everywhere. Or it's threatened or endangered throughout no more than an insignificant portion of its range. By definition, this would mean that the species in question is not threatened or endangered in a significant portion of its range. Understanding these definitions is absolutely essential for considering the aim of the law. What is recovery? How much security should our federal government provide to a species before handing that species over to a state government to be managed as a secure member of the state's biota? As you wonder about this question, what is recovery, you can find instruction, you can find an answer to the question of what is recovery by simply looking at the words themselves. Let's take those words that are italicized and underlined. Throughout all is a relatively easy concept to get your head around. Everywhere secure, throughout all, that's easy, as is significant portion. When you interpret a law, it's absolutely appropriate to apply common sense interpretations as to how a word is to be used. So in every way that matters, significant has to mean more than insignificant. Well, that's relatively simple too. Its range is where things get real tricky. What range did Congress intend? Did Congress intend that its range refer to current range? Did Congress intend that its range would refer to historical range? Depending on how you define range, it creates a whole odd suite of consequences. I believe that when you take a fair, objective look at the law itself and enabling regulations, it seems to be clear that Congress intended for range to be synonymous with historical range. At some point, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and throughout the night when I use the word service, I mean the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, it seems to me clear at some point the service understood this intent. For example, take the gray wolf in the mid-1970s. At that time, the species had been extirpated. It had been removed from all of its historical range in the continental United States, excepting about 750 animals in northeastern Minnesota, and a handful of wolves in Isle Royale National Park that have never been part of any recovery discussion. At that time, the service determined that the gray wolf should be listed as threatened in Minnesota and endangered everywhere else. The service basically concluded that for the gray wolf to be recovered, we needed paws on the ground in places like Wisconsin and Michigan and Montana and Wyoming and Idaho and the desert Southwest. During the ensuing 4.5 decades, a great deal of good recovery work has been done. Wolves have come back to all of those places, and today between 15 to 20% of the species' historical range is occupied. That's pretty good, but is it good enough? Is 15 to 20% of occupied historical range good enough? For a long time now, the service has said, yes, it's good enough. But by saying, yes, it's good enough, you know what they're also saying. They're also saying, the agency is also saying, 80 to 85% of the historical range is insignificant to the species' future. Doesn't count, doesn't matter. I have always found this to be a curious conclusion. On the surface, how can 80 to 85% of a species' historical range be insignificant? Never made any sense to me. It is especially difficult to accept this notion that 15 to 20% is good enough when you recall that the service is required by the law to operate against the best available science. That's mandated by the ESA. The service is well aware of this mandate. They readily acknowledge it, and they appropriately emphasize three important principles of conservation biology. Three very important, easily understood principles, known by the shorthand as the 3 R's: resiliency, redundancy, and representation. 3 principles that have direct bearing on the question, how much is enough? Resiliency speaks to the ability of a population to persist in the presence of challenges. It's typically measured in terms of the size of a population. The logic is simple. You would conclude that a larger population is more resilient than a smaller one. Similarly, redundancy is an easy concept to get your head around. It speaks to the ability of a species to withstand challenges. The logic being, oh my gosh, if we've got 3 or 4 resilient populations, they're more redundant, the species is more redundant, and therefore more likely to persist in the presence of catastrophes if there were fewer resilient populations. The 3rd R is the tough one. The 3rd R is representation. Representation speaks about the ability of a species to evolve against changing environmental conditions. It requires that a species be reasonably distributed throughout its historical range. Take the black-footed ferret as an example to understand this notion of representation. Black-footed ferrets are an obligate species on prairie dog colonies. You will not find a black-footed ferret anywhere where there's not a colony of prairie dogs. Matter of fact, you guys have probably never seen a black-footed ferret up close and personal. They're little bitty guys. They're only about this long. They're really small. They're only about that big around. They make a living killing prairie dogs that are typically bigger than themselves. They are a fossorial mammal. A fossorial mammal is a mammal that lives underground nearly all the time, and yet, when you look at the black-footed ferret, it has the most modest of feet and the most modest of nails. That animal couldn't dig a hole to save its life. And yet, it lives in holes all the time. Typically, you find black-footed ferrets on short grass prairie, on black-tailed prairie dog colonies. Fair enough. But when you think about representation, they also used to occur elsewhere. This picture on the right is a portion of Turner's Vermejo Park Ranch in northern New Mexico. Those grasslands are high elevation grasslands, not occupied by black-tailed prairie dogs, but rather Gunnison's prairie dogs. Gunnisons are a whole different breed of cat than a black-tailed prairie dog. That feature that you see in the back, that structure, that monolith, if you will, that's known as Castle Rock. The last black-footed ferret found in New Mexico was collected at Castle Rock. For the black-footed ferret to be properly represented, it has to not only occupy country that supports black-tailed prairie dogs, but also country that supports Gunnison prairie dogs. Low elevation short grass prairies that support black-tailed prairie dogs, and high elevation grasslands that support a very different species in the form of the Gunnison's prairie dog. Representation is a difficult principle to abide by. This is the principle the United States Fish and Wildlife Service has been inclined to marginalize for species that had large historical ranges and the potential to conflict with people. In other words, the gray wolf and the grizzly bear. My colleagues and I have taken sharp exception to the service's chronic downplaying of representation. We have published our concerns extensively over the last many years, trying in an intellectual way to move the federal agency in a useful direction. Sadly, to little avail. Our most recent effort will be published soon in the Georgetown Environmental Law Review and offers a wholly new interpretation of the all-important phrase, significant portion of its range. Our interpretation relies heavily on equating range with historical range and the common sense conclusion that for the representation principle to be satisfied, the species in question has to be reasonably distributed across its historical range so its full abilities can be expressed. I don't believe that the gray wolf is properly represented when it remains extirpated from 80 to 85% of its historical range, especially when highly suitable habitat is abundant. The Fish and Wildlife Service's disregard for this representation principle has undergirded decades of denial of high-quality habitat, 25 million acres of high-quality public lands that are ideally suited for the gray wolf. The area that I'm speaking is, of course, western Colorado. To make a very long story short, starting in 1995, I began focusing on restoring wolves to Colorado. From that year until 2014, my aim was to carve out western Colorado and northern New Mexico, the southern Rockies ecoregion, for the Mexican wolf Canis lupus bailey. 20 years of persistence was justified because there is no other way to recover the Mexican wolf in a manner that fits the spirit and intent of the Endangered Species Act if you don't move the program north into northern New Mexico and southern Colorado. By 2014, it was apparent that the service was not going to do that, but rather they were going to push the program south into Mexico. The Mexican wolf was Plan A for western Colorado. The service denied that plan, which prompted me to launch Plan B. Plan B was a simple exercise of direct democracy, a vote of the people to secure a state-based mandate to recover gray wolves in western Colorado. In other words, I built a statewide campaign to elect the wolf. did all the things that you would do to run a top-shelf statewide campaign in Colorado. Raised millions of dollars, assembled a top-shelf political team, recruited a small army of volunteers, and developed award-winning videos to educate and inspire. I'd like to show one of those videos. I am so proud of this work. It's done by my good friend Tom Winston and his crew at Grizzly Creek Films here in Montana. It only runs about 90 seconds, but I think it should do just that. The video is entitled "The Chorus of Colorado."
There's a chorus we sing here in this place, Colorado. It rings from the Maroon Bells to Mile High, from the great sand dunes to the highest town in America. In the birthplace of rodeo and the cheeseburger, where snowmelt flows into every glass. We hear it floating on the breeze above Red Rocks, or drifting way out into the backcountry where the wild things roam, and the air hums with life. It's our anthem to freedom. But listen carefully. One voice has gone missing. A note that rang through our mountains for eons has disappeared. Help us return this voice to Colorado.
The federal government's disregard for wolf recovery to be widespread is understandable. Establishing wolves is difficult. It's really hard. It's expensive, it's controversial. It sucks all the oxygen out of the room. I get it. Oh boy, do I get it. But the law doesn't say do these things until it gets hard and then stop. The law simply says do these things. I hold the service in very high regard. I was proud to wear that brown uniform so long ago. The agency has done an excellent job preventing extinctions under the Endangered Species Act. Of the 2,381 listed species, less than 1% have gone extinct. But preventing extinction is not the aim of the law. The aim of the law is recovery. Of the 2,381 species that have been listed, only 73 have been recovered. Recovery is difficult, especially for species that run headlong into our needs. Recovery is a matter altogether different than preventing extinction. Doing good on behalf of imperiled species can be hard. Hard because some have needs that contradict our needs, and we're not very good at sharing sometimes. Or it's hard because people don't care. The Boson tortoise doesn't have much of a cheering section. Sadly, though, doing good on behalf of imperiled species has become increasingly important. Have you ever heard of Whipple's monkey flower? Las Vegas dace, white-lined top minnow, sugar spoon, narrow cat's paw, Tennessee riffleshell. All of these species and many others have gone extinct in recent time. The current extinction crisis extends across epic proportions and grows more intractable by the year. Oops. Along the long sweep of time that Mother Earth has supported multicellular life, there have been 5 great extinction crises before historical time. The 5th crisis occurred about 65 million years ago when a meteor struck the planet and in a geological instant ended the reign of dinosaurs. Currently, every year, thousands of species, fine-tuned by time and place, disappear forever. Loss is so severe that the certainty of nature is being stripped away. The current extinction crisis is one of humanity's most pressing and least attended problems, and on par with the 5 previous great waves of loss that have swept across this planet over the last 500 million years. The onset of the Anthropocene, the age of man, beginning at least in the late 18th century, if not much, much earlier, marked the start of the 6th great extinction crisis because we are the cause. The crisis is a clarion call for changing our relationship with the non-human world, changing our relationship with Mother Earth. And it should matter no matter who you are. Let's assume for a moment that you're a person of faith. How can you love the Creator and not love the creation? And yet how can you stand by and watch something you love be needlessly destroyed without rising in defense? Well, let's assume the alternative. Let's assume that you're a secular humanist and you believe rather than faith, it's facts, data, logic, empiricism that matter most. Well, the best science, our most reliable knowledge, makes clear that the extinction crisis is clear evidence that landscapes around the world are not healthy for us or anything else for that matter. No matter who you are, the extinction crisis should matter. But how? How can you rise up in defense of creation? We're all busy. We all want to get 24 hours in a day, and a limited number of those, and I promise you it's later than you think. I think a good way to fight for creation is politics. More specifically, electoral politics. Most specifically, winning elections. By 7 p.m. on Tuesday, November 2nd, 2020, 3,123,612 votes had been cast relative to Colorado's wolf restoration proposition 114. When those 3 million votes had been counted, 1.59 million Coloradans said yes, and only 1.53 Coloradans said no. Never before had direct democracy been exercised to secure a restoration mandate for an imperiled species. That is electoral politics of the finest kind. The first reintroductions took place yesterday. This wolf and 4 others released by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. Success in Colorado will establish an archstone population that connects wolves from the high Arctic all the way to the Mexican border. There is no other place in the world. You can imagine restoration of a maligned, misunderstood, endangered large carnivore across a continent. That is restoration magic of the finest kind. If we win enough elections, we can reverse the extinction crisis. If we win enough elections, we can ensure that the Endangered Species Act catalyzes the good work of living with Mother Earth rather than on her. Many summers ago, now with family and friends, I had the great privilege of camping on Peel Island, a magical dot of solitude in the southern arm of Yellowstone Lake. The island is not available to the public, I and my family were there as guests of Doug Smith, who was employed by the park at the time. I don't know if Doug's in the room, but if he is, thank you for letting us tag along. And thank you, Dougie, for nearly 30 years of seminal work. The first day out on Peel Island, as the sun gave way to the moon, we heard the howl of a lone wolf, probably searching for a pal. Wolves don't like being alone. Life is difficult for any wolf, and especially so for any lone wolf. The wolf howled all night. Now, I wish I could say she howled all night or he howled all night, but I don't know the sex of the animal, so I have to refer to the wolf or it. The wolf howled all night long. It was nothing if not persistent. Since there was never a response, I thought about howling back. I've howled at a lot of wolves in my day, but that night, doing so was not the thing to do. It would have violated park policy, and Doug deserved better of me than that. So I stayed in my sleeping bag and I listened and reflected. As I did, I came to wonder if Mother Earth has been howling to us, hoping for us to respond by affirming her importance, hoping for us to respond by setting aside disregard and destruction and embracing regard and restoration. As I laid there and wondered, I recalled two questions compelled by Congressman John Lewis, the late, great American John Lewis, as he rallied the nation to embrace the rights of people of color. Two questions now apply with great force to any effort to end the extinction crisis, to any effort to rally support for the Endangered Species Act. Two very simple questions. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Most human endeavors are decidedly anthropocentric. Very few people dedicate energy to the non-human world, yet it is that part of creation that allows for and enriches the human experience. We in this room tonight can be atypical by dedicating some of our energy to the non-human world. I am inspired by what we can do on behalf of wild places and wild things. My father would be too. He understood the importance of giving over at least some of oneself to something bigger than oneself. My father, known as Papa Jack to his grandkids, was a guy's guy. He was a personal defense instructor in the Army. He had a crew cut, square jaw, big forearms and big calves. He was plain and hard spoken. He was the quintessential baseball coach. I thought the world of him. He never knew me as a state senator. He died before I was sworn into that chamber in 2013. But he cried when I was sworn into the Montana House in 2007. Before that, I didn't think my father had that degree of emotion in him. His tears made clear that he valued service, valued effort on behalf of something bigger than oneself. I mentioned my father because he'd be excited by the opportunity before us as voters to elect people who care about the non-human world, who care about wild places and wild things. Elect people who will stand with the underdog and not give way. I also mentioned my father because 26 years ago, nearly to the day, he attended a talk I gave on the Endangered Species Act at the Minnesota Zoo in the Twin Cities. I knew beforehand that he was coming, so I worked really hard to prepare. I intended to deliver the performance of a lifetime. I wanted to make my father proud. I did good that night. I did good. But as we walked out of the theater, he was uncharacteristically quiet. As my family can attest, my father typically was not at a loss for words. As we're walking across the parking lot, I expected at least an attaboy, right? I did okay, an attaboy. He didn't say anything, so before we got in the car, I asked him, so, Dad, what'd you think? And he waited for a moment before he responded, and he said quite simply, you know, Mike, you did good, but you need to be more funny. My father thought I needed to be more funny. You know how hard it is to be funny on purpose? It is really hard to be funny on purpose. You've got to be really smart to be funny on purpose. But in honor of my father, and in honor of the power of laughter, I'm going to end this evening with an Endangered Species Act joke. Actually, no, hang on. I'm going to end with two jokes, right? If one joke is good, two jokes is better. So here we go. There was this rabbi and a car salesman and a farmer's daughter. No, I'm messing with you. The first joke. It might be a bit politically incorrect. If I offend, I don't mean to. But you've probably heard that anti-vaxxers are going to be protected under the Endangered Species Act because their children are threatened with extinction. Come on. There you go, that's right. All right, here we go. We'll call that 1 for 1. Here we go, 2 for 2. Why are frogs on the endangered species list? Because they croak a lot. Thank you for coming. Thank you for listening. Merry Christmas.